if we can go live. Are we live? We're going to find out. I'm looking at your comments here. Yes, we're live on YouTube. Hi, everyone. It's me, Dr. Z, Zubin Damania, your friend and confidant. Is this actually working? I don't know. Let's find out. Let's pop out the live chat here so we can look at your comments. Okay, we're going to talk about mixing vaccines today and a little bit about Novavax, and then I'm going to take Q&A from you guys because why not, man? It's Wednesday, June 30th, about 2:24 Pacific time. We're live out of Studio Z. There, I've done all the busy work here. All right. A lot of people seem to be concerned about this idea of mixing and matching vaccines. And it's become an issue because, first of all, vaccines outside of the US in particular are rather limited in a couple of ways. One is maybe they just aren't there and you get what you can get when you can get it. Or you have a situation like you have in Europe and Canada where something like AstraZeneca was initially recommended. Then the evidence that these very rare but very serious clotting effects could happen in very young people, particularly women of a certain age up to about 50. And so some of these governments said, hey, stop, young people, don't take that. Well, now they're just like, well, the ones who got the dose already wonder, well, can I then get a Pfizer dose? Or something else instead of the second dose of AstraZeneca. And so it's become a question. So several groups are studying it around the country. A group led by a Professor Snape, I can't make this stuff up, out of Great Britain, actually published some information. And I think it's still preprint-ish, but it was reported on in New York Times and elsewhere. And basically what they reported was that they did a study where they said, okay, it's participant blinded, meaning the people in the trial didn't know what they were getting. But I think the investigators knew what was going on. And they said, okay, we're going to have these basically 4 different regimens of vaccination. And we're going to measure not outcomes like do they get COVID or do they die or do they get hospitalized, because probably there wasn't enough resources to do that, to catch enough cases and enough hospitalizations. So they used a surrogate marker endpoint. That's a fancy way of saying they measured something in the blood to see, does it we think this correlates to immunity and efficacy of the vaccine. So let's measure this and see if mixing and matching these vaccines has any effect on their ability to generate these surrogate markers, that being antibodies. So IgG antibodies against spike protein, I think, is what they measured in this trial. So they said, okay, let's try this. 1 Pfizer dose, 4 weeks later, the second Pfizer dose, right? Let's measure antibodies. And they got this many antibodies. All right. Then they did the same thing with AstraZeneca and AstraZeneca. So the standard AstraZeneca regimen, like 4 weeks apart. Now, this is important because there's some evidence that perhaps spacing out AstraZeneca further, the adenovector vaccines like AstraZeneca, might be more efficacious in immune response. So, but this is the 4-week regimen that they measured. Okay. And they said, okay, when we do it that way, it turns out that you get 10 times less antibodies generated from 2 doses of AstraZeneca than you do from 2 doses of Pfizer. Now, this is interesting because the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, have been associated with very high antibody levels. They're very immunogenic when it comes to antibodies. But interestingly, the adenovirus vector vaccines like Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca actually are associated with a little more robust T cell response, which is a different sort of aspect of the adaptive immune system. And so they're kind of different angles on it. Now, clinically, what we see out in the world is the mRNA vaccines are very, very effective clinically, right? Even against Delta variant and all of that. AstraZeneca, pretty effective, but less so maybe than the mRNA vaccines. And so could it be that the antibody response, at least initially, is important? Maybe longer term, we don't know, right? Because it might be that those T cells memory T cells, that sort of thing, is a bigger effect long term. We just don't know. But what we do have the data for is at these antibodies levels. So 2 doses of Pfizer, 10x the antibody response as 2 doses of AstraZeneca. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When they did Pfizer followed by AstraZeneca, they got 5x more antibodies than just AstraZeneca and AstraZeneca alone. So that's interesting. So mixing already gives you an advantage over just AstraZeneca in terms of antibodies measured, right? But not quite as many as Pfizer and Pfizer. But check this out. When they did AstraZeneca first, like many people in Europe and others have gotten that AstraZeneca, but they never got the second, and you follow it up with Pfizer, you get nearly as many antibodies as 2 doses of Pfizer. So I think the bottom line is from that data is that it seems the mixing effect does seem to work. Now, the question is, again, what are the roles of the T cell component of it? There was some, and I didn't see the raw data on this, but Professor Snape mentioned that, I'm like, is he good? Is he bad? What's going on? Does he like Harry? Does he hate Harry? Snape I just can't say that with a straight face. Matthew Snape, that's his full name, said that there is, and I read this elsewhere as well, that there is, it seems, an even more robust T cell response when you mix the vaccines than when you just give 2 of the same vaccine. But it's hard to tease out whether that's due to a slight extra spacing of the second dose or other effects. So probably more research is needed. Now, there are other groups like mixing and matching all kinds of things. They're also going to add Moderna and the new Novavax into the mix of the studies. Now, so what does this mean? I think it means that people who are stressed about mixing an AstraZeneca with a Pfizer shouldn't be. I imagine mixing an AstraZeneca with a Moderna is probably not a big deal either because they're so similar in technology, the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna. I got the Moderna myself, 2 shots of the Moderna. Now, one thing they did notice is when they mixed, they found that some of these like headache, fever, those kind of short-term side effects that you get from the vaccine seem to be a little bit more in Snape's trial when you mix. But I haven't seen that raw data because I think it was a preprint. I didn't see all the results. So I think people can be pretty comfortable so far that 2 doses, if they're mixed, is fine. Now, there are some people who still are like, well, what if I just get 1 dose? And I think if you're looking at these surrogate endpoints, and if you're looking at like the data against Delta variant in Great Britain, 1 shot, assuming you haven't been infected with coronavirus before as your primer, your first priming dose, seems to be less effective against these variants. Now, less effective meaning what? Like, are you less likely to die? Like, are you less likely to be asymptomatically infected? And that's important because in the end, what we really care about is hospitalizations, deaths, also long COVID. But, the long COVID thing is so poorly understood. We have no clue what we're talking about when we even talk about long COVID. It's been poorly characterized. There's a lot of confounders. And the real aspects of it are a lot of people complain that they have long-term symptoms after coronavirus infection, even mild infection, even young people with no comorbidities. So the question is, do any of these vaccine regimens impact that? And I just don't know that it's been looked at. So we have to admit what we don't know, and we don't know. But I think that mixing and matching is probably fine. Now, what about mixing Pfizer and Moderna? I think just from first principles, you have to do the study, right, if you really want to know, but it seems like it wouldn't be a problem. So this is encouraging because it's really encouraging, especially for the rest of the world where vaccines are not as easily available as they are in the United States, where people still don't even want to get them. I think it's also interesting from a standpoint of, this idea of, well, there are different side effects potentially there are different rare side effects for each class of vaccine. Like the mRNA vaccines may cause rare myocarditis, which is mostly reversible in younger people. The AstraZeneca may cause very rare but catastrophic unreversible blood clotting in rare cases, particularly in women. So you can start to decide, based on your own risk profile and what your tolerance is for risk and what you want to do, which vaccines, either individually or mixed and matched, you might be able to do. So I think this is helpful understanding. Let's look, before we go on to Novavax, let's read some comments. Stingray says, Moderna on the rocks, shaken, not stirred. This is why I love my supporters, man. Stingray. Ball Boys, another great name. What if you do it like a frat party fruit punch and just poured it all into a single vial? There was a time when I was very conditioned as a medical resident at Stanford, and Pfizer would show up and, and sponsor our drug lunches, like not drug lunches, they were our noon conferences. This was back in the day when it was a free-for-all. And if you think that stuff doesn't influence you, so back then, I remember thinking, you know what we should do? We should put a little Novovax, which was a Pfizer drug, some Lipitor, a baby aspirin, maybe a low-dose beta blocker in a single pill, grind it up and put it in the water supply, and we would fix most of what I see in the hospital. And we seriously would say stuff like that. Like, man, that would just cure all this stuff. I mean, now look at that, how delusional that is. First of all, how about you prevent the diseases those things treat with better diet, exercise, stress reduction? Second of all, just think of the massive side effects that people would get from a cocktail of drugs like that in the water. Now, but I'm joking, right? But we seriously would have these conversations in the sense that, we were that into the medical management of disease, because when you train for 10,000 hours in that, that's what you train in, right? And so, this idea that, there's a therapeutic for everything. Well, what about prevention? Now, that's why I like vaccines, because they actually are a preventative therapy. It's a different thing, and it's using your own natural immune system to fight disease, right? That's why I'm always a little biased, and this is just putting my bias on the table, towards preventative therapeutics like that than, therapeutic therapeutics where you're trying to treat something even prophylactically with a drug. And speaking of which, well, here, let's read some more comments, because these are good good comments. But it's important to understand where your biases come from. Now, years later, I'm biased in the opposite direction. Like, I think less is more. The less you do to people, the better off they are, the more you educate and the more you focus on prevention. Now, with coronavirus, there are those who argue that, well, if we just had good vitamin D, take ivermectin or something like that, we'll eradicate it. I think some of that is wishful thinking, but some of that, especially talking about the fact that, well, why is it that people die from coronavirus? Well, it's because they have an inflammatory state that's usually due to obesity, a shitty Western diet, diabetes, hypertension, end-stage renal disease, these kind of things that are actually generally preventable with taking care of ourselves. And the fact that we're constantly under high stress and we're constantly in an environment that creates an inflammatory state in us, it's almost like coronavirus is laughing. It's like, oh, look at this. Like, when it comes to America, it's like, these guys are perfect. Like, they're fat, they're stressed, they're depressed, they're totally inflamed. They think a pill will cure everything. Well, no pill's going to cure me. So here I come, right? And so what do we do with vaccines? We kind of coax our immune system to go, okay, now you have to do the work, because no medicine's going to fix this. It really is going to be the human body that generates immunity. And we need a shorter cut, because we can't get all Americans in shape that fast, because we haven't been able to do it for decades, despite the food pyramid, which was a disaster. Body food, what's your opinion on the hopefully soon to be EUA'd Medicago VLP vaccine, supposedly 10 times antibody response in phase 2 as mRNA? I don't have an opinion on it yet, but I know that not all mRNA vaccines seem to be created equal, for sure. The CureVac vaccine, which was another company, actually failed pretty miserably in their trials. So it was like less than 50% efficacy. And that's an mRNA vaccine. So it's not that mRNA in itself is some magical technology. It has to be implemented correctly. Now, the two big players, Moderna and Pfizer, happen to have an advantage in that they partnered with a larger. So you have BioNTech that partnered with Pfizer. So they were able to take their little startup juice and really weaponize it through lots of resources and lots of knowledge. And Moderna did the same thing, but using NIH. So, a lot of people don't know that that's how those partnerships worked, that got those mRNA technologies on the table quicker. And actually, that's a good segue into what, it's AstraZeneca and Oxford. It's a good segue into Novavax. So Novavax, smaller company, totally different technology. Not totally different, meaning it's a technology that we've used in vaccines before. So the pertussis vaccine, Certain influenza vaccines actually use the same technology that Novavax uses. Now, Novavax is back in the news because their later trial now shows really good efficacy, like almost 90%. So up in the range of the mRNA vaccines, and it's a different approach. So first of all, it uses, instead of giving a genetic instruction to our cells, either through a nanoparticle-coated mRNA fragment that teaches our deltoid cells to make spike protein, present it to helper T cells that then engage B cells and activate this whole immune, adaptive and innate immune process. They instead do something quite ingenious in a different way. They take a baculovirus, which is a virus that only infects insect cells, and they load it with the same sort of genetic instructions to make spike protein, just the spike protein. That baculovirus then is allowed to infect a culture of moth cells. Don't ask. And so these moth cells then are infected with this baculovirus genetic code that then tells the moth cells to become little cellular factories and make purified spike protein. So tons of spike protein is spit out. And it turns out that when you do it that way, you can then purify the spike protein and make a vaccine out of it. Now, you would need a lot of spike protein to generate a good immune response if you didn't do the second step of this vaccine, which is something called an adjuvant. An adjuvant is something that's added to vaccines that makes them more likely to generate a strong immune response to the antigen that they're trying to generate the immune response to. So it helps like jazz up the immune response to whatever you're targeting. So in this case, they use an extract from, I think it's the soapbark tree. It's a saponin. It's a kind of compound that comes from a tree that it turns out, and these trees actually have these really interesting innate immune responses too. Actually, non-vertebrate animals, so animals without spinal cords, don't really have this adaptive immune response with antibodies and that kind of thing, but they have very robust, innate, broad immune responses. But that's a whole nother talk. So they use this then as an adjuvant that allows them to have to use less of the purified spike protein to generate a really good immune response. And it seems to work. Now, what are the advantages of Novavax? Well, unlike Pfizer, it's refrigerator stable, so easier to transport, kind of like some of the other vaccines that aren't Pfizer. It's cheaper than Pfizer, and it still requires 2 doses, about 4 weeks apart, but it doesn't contain PEG, that polyethylene glycol, that the mRNA vaccines do, that some people are allergic to, that may trigger anaphylaxis in people who are allergic to it. So it doesn't have that. And on top of that, it if people have this sort of uptightness about mRNA or, is it gene therapy and all of this, which, by the way, just don't. But look, if you have that concern, this doesn't have that. If you've gotten your kids the pertussis vaccine or you the pertussis vaccine, you've had this sort of technology in a vaccine before. So I think it's a really promising vaccine. And actually, I talked about it a few months ago when the first preliminary data came out, and I was quite jazzed about it. The problem is now, because we're awash in vaccines in the United States, we can't really, I don't think FDA is going to really push hard to EUA it, but I hope they look at it very carefully, because especially for the rest of the world, it's going to be an important option. Now, one thing I didn't talk about much was J&J, right? It's kind of like the also ran in the U.S. It's only 4% of all vaccines administered in the U.S. because I think of the pause early on, like, gave people a lot of pause. I think it really stigmatized that vaccine when you already have a lot of the mRNAs that came earlier. And Johnson & Johnson as a company is just kind of like, they've got a lot of stigma from their, talcum powder thing, and they're involved somehow in the opioid crisis, and it's just kind of like, geez. And I don't know. It's something this has no. I'm not even going to say it because it's pure limbic system emotional response to Johnson & Johnson. But yeah, let's just say I don't love these large corporations in general, right? You guys know I have my doubts and suspicions about these big companies, but I'm not crazy about it, right? Because I also know people who work in their R&D who are wonderful and are doing great science. So Johnson & Johnson, like some people are like, should I get a Pfizer after Johnson & Johnson and all that? I just don't think we have any data to say one way or another whether that's going to be helpful, right? That's a great vaccine in the sense that it's a single dose, and it seems to be very effective, particularly in elders, against severe disease and death, which is, again, what we mostly care about. Again, not understanding what long COVID is and that sort of thing. All right, let's take a look. So these kind of comments like bomb bape. A guy in Sweden died last night. He got really sick from the first AstraZeneca shot, and 2 months later, he got the Moderna shot and died. Okay, so you got to ask these questions when you read stuff like that on the interwebs, all right? First of all, did the shot cause his death? Okay, it's possible, right? Because sometimes just the stress of getting the side effects from those shots, like the fevers and the aches and the elevated heart rate, can kill somebody who's susceptible, who couldn't survive a stress test. But you got to remember this, they wouldn't have survived COVID. So it's kind of like, where do you take your risk? Roll the dice with a vaccine that generally is quite safe, or roll the dice with getting COVID, which generally for you is not safe. Like that's pretty assured going to be a ride for you. Now, the second thing you have to wonder is this correlation? So the guy was going to die of something got him. It just happened to correlate to when they got the vaccine, right? That's fully possible. I think you can look at that in terms of the, there's a story out recently about a 13-year-old boy who got a second Pfizer shot and then died like the next day. And the question was, and he had like evidence of fluid around the heart or something. So the question is, was this myocarditis, pericarditis with an arrhythmia or something like that killed him? Now you have to investigate that very carefully because it's possible, right? It's always within the realm of possible, but you're going to have to do a full autopsy, look at the heart biopsy, dig into it. And even then it's not always clear because myocarditis actually happens. It happens to young people. It happens post-viral. It happens for no reason that we can detect sometimes. So there's some silent infection or some exposure to something that causes it. So it just becomes tricky. Now, again, so these are the kind of unknowns with vaccine, right? Like, so you can't say 100%. But what are the knowns that we do have? Well, we know COVID is a pain in the ass. And if you get it, it can be a problem. Now with kids, that calculation is a little bit different. Yeah, it could be a problem. Yeah, you could get MIS-C. Yeah, you could be one of these kids that gets long COVID. Again, whatever that is, we don't really know yet. Or you could be, in what's probably the majority definitely the majority, and have nothing happen beyond a little cold or flu type symptoms or nothing. So then the risk calculation with vaccine. Now, the big organizations have done this risk calculation, including CDC, and they've said, look, it still looks like the risk of getting injured or dead or problematic from COVID is worse for kids than any risk from vaccine that we know of. So, and that's probably statistically true. But is it emotionally true for you? Now, remember, we don't do well understanding risk and making decisions based on risk because we're emotional creatures. But the question is, with kids, how much does that matter if we're emotional? Is it going to affect the broader public health, like schools and things like that? And I and Vinay Prasad and Monica Gandhi and Lucy McBride and others have argued that no, it probably will not. Just looking at the data we have so far. Now, that could be falsified. It could be untrue. But from what we've seen so far, I don't think so. So again, I think with kids, it's really up to the choice, knowing risk benefits on both sides of the thing. And I made a video about that before. Z-Dog and family would have been fine without the vax, but gave in to peer pressure, says Shane Carlson. We're a two-physician household with two very intelligent daughters. The 13-year-old daughter, me and my wife, all sat down and said, what would you like to do about the vaccine? It's available for us. We can get it tomorrow. And after talking about risk benefits, pros, cons, including school and having to quarantine and being able to travel easily with to Hawaii without having to get tested, and all her friends are getting vaccinated, and so being able to play without their parents forcing us to wear masks, all those other things. So if you call that peer pressure, or you can call that adults and children making rational decisions based on risks, benefits, pros, and cons together. I like to look at it that way. Peer pressure would have been like, hey, everybody else is getting their kid vaccinated. You better get your kid vaccinated, and you better videotape it because you're a public figure and you need to set an example. So what did I do? I made a video where I said, hey, I'm not really sure all kids should get this vaccine. Here are the pros and the cons. And by the way, we're not talking about the cons enough. And by the way, here's my daughter getting vaccinated because we did talk about pros and cons, and she wants to get it, and I don't disagree, and my wife agrees, so we're getting it. But your mileage may vary. That's it. What I find is those kind of like rational, nuanced discussions don't fly on YouTube or social media very well. They really don't. You have to come out either as heterodox, so in other words, completely against what the mainstream is saying, you know what, these guys are all bought out, there's institutional capture, they're suppressing ivermectin, they're suppressing vitamin D, these vaccines are gene therapy, and it's spike protein is a toxin, and so on. So just pure heterodoxy, meaning just opposing what the mainstream is saying based on whatever your stance is on that. So you either do that and you just go absolutely viral and everybody loves you and you have this rabid fan base of lunatics with very low IQs and high IQs. It's actually a rather interesting distribution from what I can read in the comments. Or you go full mainstream. I care about my community, so I mask up and vax up. And anyone who doesn't is a murderer of grandma and babies. And keep the schools closed, by the way. Because I'm rich enough to educate my kid at home with tutors and Zoom, because I'm in the Zoomocracy. So you're either in that group or you're in the heterodox loony group, loony for the sake of being loony. And anything in between, anything alt-middle that can see some truth on all those sides just gets like comments like, oh, you're a bald fucking pharma shill, or you're killing grandma, from either side. It's a fun place to be. Thanks, Midnight Baker. Whoa. Somebody hit me with some DOP 250, however much that is. Ilalsa Lasa International says, hola, Dr. Z. Love the show. We're in the Dominican Republic. Hola. We got 2 shots of Sinovac, now being told to get Pfizer as a booster. Any thoughts? Okay, this is a great question. You got 2 of the Sinovac. Okay, now, everything I've seen about Sinovac makes me think it's a garbage vaccination against variants. So if you look at what's happening in Seychelles, you know, a lot of them got Sinovac. There were a lot of infections afterwards. I just, again, and I haven't looked into the primary data on Sinovac. I'm not even sure I can access it. If I'm wrong, share it with me. But I don't think it's a great vaccine. It's just, that's my intuition. I'm just being completely authentic with you. It's what I would tell my friends and family if they were saying, okay, I have the choice of Sinovac or AstraZeneca. I'm like, AstraZeneca. Okay, I have the choice of AstraZeneca or Pfizer. This is tougher. You know, I don't know that we fully know, but since I got Moderna, I'd probably say get Pfizer or Moderna because I did well with it and enjoyed the side effects of it. I mean, you know, again, at this point, it becomes subtle. But with Sinovac, I think if they're giving you the option of even getting a single second dose of Pfizer, I would do that personally. I would, in light of, you know, the spread of more transmissible variants that seem to resist monoclonal antibodies, but not the current armamentarium of Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, maybe J&J, right? Maybe. Megan Hooper, 2 in the current healthcare worker job market will be vaccinated versus not vaccinated effect if they are chosen for a position. I don't know what that means. Can you rephrase that? I don't know. I read that and then realized I have 2 in the healthcare job market are being vaccinated versus not vaccinated. In fact, they are chosen for a position. Yeah, I don't know what that means. Joshua Wingstrom, what do you mean they don't fly? That's what those of us in the alt. That's why those of us in the alt middle are here. Josh Wingstrom. Yeah, I know. But you guys are you're my people. Meaning we're all the tribe, right? Like we're all simpatico, but we're still Actually, let's think about that. Are we a raging minority or are we actually a silent majority? Let's talk about that. When you see someone like, you know, whoever online that's spreading some kind of idea that's kind of seems a little crazy, gets tons of followers, and you just then assume that the majority of ding-dongs in the US believe this about whatever, vaccines, whatever Sherry Tenpenny is saying, or whoever these cuckoo quacks are. And Tenpenny's not even heterodox. She's just crazy. You assume then by extrapolation that a lot of people believe that. But in truth, it's a tiny tribal sub-segment, because what's happened to society is we've fractionated into these little mini tribes, and online social media algorithms actually hyper stimulate that. They actually really facilitate that kind of tribalism so that you're in an echo chamber. So actually you look at another echo chamber and see it as some big threat to like sanity of the world. Whereas in reality, it's a bunch of jackoffs in their basement. You know, it's like not that many people. So when we say, is the alt middle actually a minority or a majority kind of view, we just don't know, because social media is so polarized that in our tribe, we're going to see a lot of alt middle thinking. But then, like, for example, today, my friend David Fuller at Rebel Wisdom, really smart guy, great podcast that he does, had me on a show and put it up live today. And if you look at the comments, like the tribalism in the comments, like this guy's a mainstream mouthpiece, like he's a pharma shill. Remember what he said about Gert van den Bossche? Yeah, I said, I think they should listen to Gert, but debunk him because I think he's wrong for these reasons. Also, I like his accent. That's what I said about Gert van den Bossche. And so it's so tribalized that you can even go on another podcast that you would think has kind of this same vibe of trying to make sense, but then you see the factionalization in the comments and you might just assume everybody's crazy or everybody hates everybody. But I don't think that's really true. I think it's an artifact of our social media siloification. I don't actually think it's true. I think there are a lot more people that would, if you got them in a room, they'd agree on more things than they disagree on, and they'd actually listen to each other and assume good intent and actually find a little truth in a lot of the viewpoints they thought were abjectly evil or wrong because of social media. I think that's really true, actually. Thank you, Love to Cook. Shane Carlson, they aren't cuckoo if people are dying and being injured. Evidence speaks for itself. Okay, so show me the evidence. And not correlation. I want to see well-designed trials showing masses of people are injured. So this is one thing that really bothers me about the heterodox view on this. And again, remember, I'm very sympathetic to a stiff middle finger to the mainstream narrative. I really am. Even though I was conditioned, like I said, in my training, I unconditioned that pretty rapidly by quitting everything, moving to Las Vegas, starting a crazy model clinic that does things completely differently, surrounding myself with people that challenge all kinds of my beliefs and authority and thinking in general, and now doing what I'm doing. So I'm very sympathetic to this idea, and I've said it about a lot of things in healthcare, right? That's why a lot of people follow me, is because they know I'm going to say whatever I think, and I really am not in anyone's pocket. I'm in my supporters' pocket, right? And if they, and what's weird about them is they don't have a consistent belief beyond the belief about belief that everything should be challenged and questioned, right? So let's talk about this heterodox view that these vaccines are poisoning tons of people. I have a direct line to healthcare people around the country. Believe me, they message me en masse to the tune of 1,000 to 2,000 emails a week, right? And I am not hearing peep about injuries from vaccine. I'm hearing a lot about what COVID does, but I'm not hearing a peep about it. Now, I did hear, so you think, oh, maybe they're not telling me or something's not happening. No, I did hear about the myocarditis before it even became a big thing. People were telling me, we're seeing these interesting heart cases with COVID in patients. And I remember thinking, well, okay, I wonder if the vaccine can cause a similar thing with the same antigenic response. And so you do hear these things. Now, why would I not hear any of this? Believe me, if I started hearing this everywhere, I'd be talking a lot about things that these guys are talking about on, like, these shows, right? But I don't. And some of their scientific reasoning, I just disagree with. I'm like, I disagree from a scientific standpoint. I don't think that's correct. Okay, cool. That's what science is. You debate it, right? But we're just not seeing it. Now, people hear anecdotes. They look at social media. And okay, that's not a healthcare practitioner taking care of a patient who has this thing. That's some schmo online going, I got the vaccine and then my penis shrank. And it's like, your dick was already small. Like, you needed a reason. Now you have a reason. That's an interesting metaphor. Okay. What do you think of medical doctors raising real questions? Dr. Robert Malone, Brett Weinstein, and others. So, okay, Brett Weinstein is not a medical doctor. He's an evolutionary biologist, very smart guy, very good guy, not a medical doctor. Malone, I don't know if he's a medical doctor or a PhD, but what do I think about it? Sure. Raise all the concerns publicly you want and debate them and debate other scientists directly. Right? It's one thing to go on Weinstein's show and say, well, this is the thing and go viral. It's another thing to get, say, a world-class virologist to sit down with you and talk about the science you're talking about and then see what precipitates from that. Maybe they change each other's minds and therefore influence the audience. But what I find instead is we all get in our echo chambers and shout at the camera and say this and that. And I'm guilty of this too. The reason I don't debate these people directly, because I get offers, oh, you should debate Nick or Gert von den Bosche. I'm like, but I'm not the first of all, I don't debate. I have conversations. Second of all, why wouldn't you get a actual virologist to go point by point by point? Because one of Van den Bosch's things is he goes, well, here's what about this and what about this and what about this and what about this? It's like, okay. I mean, I have a vague understanding and I can speak to it, but if you really want to get in the weeds on it, get a virologist and then have somebody moderate the thing like me or Weinstein, right? Okay, I know Brett's a great moderator when he wants to do that. So he could do that. I could do that. That's fine. Actually, I need to develop capacity in the studio to have more than one guest because then we could really do it, right? And then people have to come to the Bay, but we could do it by Zoom. It's not a big deal. So these things are doable, but we don't really even try. And I'm guilty a little too because there is a part of me that's just like, okay, you know, some people are just, they have real valid concerns. They really believe them. But I look at it and I'm just like, this is so wrong. Do I even want to spend more time on this? Like in my scientific opinion, for whatever that's worth, right? And could I be wrong? Sure, I've been wrong before. I'm wrong a lot. I'm an idiot just like everybody, right? Just have a little more education. You know, Daniel Silverman says the best disinfectant for misinformation or bad data is science and sunlight. Right. So if you think someone's spreading misinformation, don't block them on YouTube. Don't take down their video. Go, okay, well, all right, we have a moderator here. We have another scientist who's willing to do it. The problem is the scientists are busy doing science. It's not always that they can just, you know, come on a show and debate some, you know, and I've said this before, there's always some kind of dude who has legit credentials, right? Who's like, you know, and they've been popularized in movies, right? It's like the one asteroid scientist who's like, that asteroid's going to hit us, man. And none of the other scientists are listening and the government won't listen, man. And then the asteroid hits us and now they're the hero. So that's been popularized. And it's actually been true in certain cases in medical history. Ignaz Semmelweis on hand washing, the guy who discovered H. pylori causes stomach ulcers, those kind of things. You know, they were kind of vilified and ignored for, you know, quite a while. You know, Ignaz died in a mental institution. So now, you know, it's kind of romanticized a little to be that outlier that just happens to know something that everybody else doesn't know. But the thing is, we also all know the kooky guy in the group of scientists that's just wrong, right? But has a really loud voice and he's always at the conference raising his hand and going, but what about this? You know, one guy like that was Peter Duesberg. Do you guys remember Peter Duesberg? So Duesberg was a UC Berkeley professor when I was there as an undergraduate. He became infamous. He's a molecular biology researcher. He was in my department. I did my honors thesis in genetics in that same life sciences department at UC Berkeley in the 90s. And he was quite notorious, along with another guy there that used to teach a class I took, for saying, really being heterodox, saying HIV, which was the big thing at the time, did not cause AIDS. that AIDS was caused by the drugs we use to treat HIV and by the behaviors of gay men, you know, nitrate poppers and the type of sexual stuff they were doing. And that's what he was saying. And of course, you know, that has culture war implications. It has moral palate implications. It has all kinds of implications, including scientific implications. And he said, no, you know, this virus doesn't fulfill Koch's postulates, you know, all these other things he was saying. And he became quite famous to the point where he was advising South Africa's government. Now, that's fine. I actually, even at the time, I was like, well, this is an interesting angle in that someone should debunk him properly. And of course, the entire community of HIV researchers argued with him and said, this is wrong for these reasons. And it was a vigorous debate. But in those days, there was actual debate, right? And there wasn't an internet really. It was all like government stuff and academic stuff, the internet and email in those days. And so, but he still had this influence on the South African government, which then would not provide antiretrovirals to its population at some point, right? So these kind of things became action items of harm, which is why the scientists get all uppity about it. Now, you could argue the same thing's happening if these guys are discouraging vaccination, since it's shown to be quite effective against coronavirus. But I actually am not too uptight about that, because the way I see this is, look, people choose where to get their information. If they choose to get it from Cranky McCrank on YouTube versus Fauci McFouch versus CDC McWho, you know, they're just going to go where they go. Ultimately, there's a mainstream narrative on this that evolves, and there's a counter narrative. And they're going to make their choice, and they're going to live with the results of it. And I do my best to try to navigate where I think the truth is, and it evolves and it changes. And believe me, I have sleepless nights when I think I might have gotten it wrong and I have to do something different and do a different video. So, you know, I'm not married to being right about anything. In fact, it's kind of fun when you're proven wrong. It's painful, but it's kind of fun because then you can do a video and go, man, was I wrong, right? But yeah, let's see. Okay, so Shane is just like one of these natural people. Just doesn't think anything we do is correct. So FEMA Jacob, can vaccinated people create stronger mutations? That's a brilliant question. Let's talk about that. So by vaccinating people, you create an immune response that prevents viral replication with the current types of viruses, including the variants to a large degree. So if you have, let's say right now, we 100% vaccinated the whole population, I think the virus would be like, no targets. It wouldn't even be able to replicate much. You wouldn't even be able to generate new variants, and it would go extinct, right? Unless there's an animal reservoir where it can hide and then reinfect unvaccinated people later in the future, or mutate in the animal reservoir through replication, and then a variant version comes out. But let's say you have, you know, a bunch of people vaccinated and a bunch of people not, which is what we have. Well, now you're going to have viral replication, and the chances are that you might arise a variant that does escape the immune response from the vaccine, in which case it's going to become dominant. So it's possible, and in fact, you might not ever select for that variant if you hadn't vaccinated people in the first place. In other words, if there's no environmental pressure for that virus to do that, to be the dominant virus, then it might never happen, right? Because there's no reason. Because with each of these mutations, sometimes they come at a cost to the virus. But the virus is willing, and I act like it's conscious. It's not. It's a particle. The dynamics will tolerate that because it'll replicate even despite its disadvantage, because it's the only way it can replicate, because the vaccines are so good, is to circumvent vaccines. But in the process, maybe it becomes less deadly. Maybe it becomes more like a cold. Or maybe it's less contagious when it does that. Or, you know, maybe it only infects people with severe comorbidities, you know, whatever it is. So things can change. The thing that people need to realize, though, is that there isn't unlimited mutational potential here. There's a narrow parameter within which this thing can do this, because there's only so much spike protein and there's only so many mutations that don't damage the virus that it will tolerate. And then it still has to get away from very robust, broad immunity across the spike protein that these vaccines generate. So even though you're putting pressure on it, it may not be capable of doing this for quite some time or ever. And if it does, the nice thing about, in particular, all these vaccines is you can update them with a new genetic code for the new spike protein that this thing makes, and problem mostly solved. Now, what von den Bussche, I think, is arguing a little bit, which is interesting, is that after you get that first exposure to this wild type viral situation, the subsequent immune exposures are less robust at generating response. And that may be true, right? So his thing was, well, we're going to generate these immune escapes and then we're not going to be able to handle them. But I don't think we really have a good precedent for that. And I don't think we're even seeing that happening yet now. Now, of course, we don't have very high penetrance of vaccine except in US, Israel, and so forth, right? And Great Britain. But again, should you be thinking about this stuff? Sure. Am I staying up all night worrying about it? Not yet, for the reasons that I mentioned. Bonnie Welch, if I got 2 AstraZenecas, why not get a Pfizer boost? Man, you're a real vaccine gunner, man. I just don't know what the incremental benefit of that would be. You know, maybe it's a little better against variants, but I would ask you this. Are you a high risk person? Are you like somebody who's young and otherwise healthy? Then don't even think about it. If you're someone who's like, 70 with comorbidities, then that's a question you can ask, right? A little incremental benefit and willing to put up with the side effects of it, meaning the chills and the fevers and the muscle aches and all that. First detected Delta case in India was a fully co-vaxxed patient. Okay, let's talk about that. Vaccine failure in Delta. So these vaccines, as you know, are roughly 90-ish% in clinical practice out in the world, even against Delta. Well, what does that mean? That means 10% of people who are fully vaccinated can still be infected with Delta and potentially get severe disease, right? Although those are a smaller percentage, and die, although those are a smaller percentage. And it becomes a situation like this. If a lot of people are are vaccinated and there's a lot of Delta in the community, well, you're going to get vaccinated people who get sick. It's happening in Great Britain because so many elders are vaccinated, I think 90% of elders, I forget what the number was, in Great Britain are vaccinated. And so now when Delta is circulating in Great Britain in unvaccinated people and younger people, because they're mostly unvaccinated, some of the elders are getting sick and dying with the Delta variant, which is, again, exactly what you would predict from the dynamics and the statistics of the vaccine efficacy. So the question is, how do you protect them? Well, you vaccinate as many people as you can so there's less circulating virus, so there's less Delta just replicating in unvaccinated people, and or you mask up people at high risk even if they're vaccinated. So if you're very high risk and you're worried about it, then you can wear a mask. I mean, it might reduce your chances a little bit. Again, we don't have good data on that, so I'm always reluctant to advocate that. Although apparently the WHO and LA is not, for that reason. They're like, well, because it's not perfect and there's a lot of people in the community that aren't vaccinated spreading Delta around. It's like, well, all right. But in reality, how safe do you really want to be? This virus already has a 0.2 to 0.3% infection fatality rate across all ages. If you're in a high risk age group with comorbidities, you take more precautions. Targeted protection. Jay Bhattacharya and others have talked about this. I agree. That's a heterodox view, by the way. That's a very heterodox view. It's not a mainstream view at all. The Great Barrington Declaration got a lot of shit, but I think they were right. So you can do that for high-risk people. For everyone else, just live your damn lives. Take your mask off, get vaccinated or don't, and live your life. Because again, the absolute risk to you is quite small. So that's the way I think about it. Wouldn't natural infection have gained immunity Or wouldn't natural infection gained immunity force mutations, Jan Spence? Another great question. So, Jan, when you have a population that's got natural antibodies from being infected with the wild-type coronavirus, excuse me, I'm dying. Look at this. Science the crap out of it. This is some old Z-Dog merch. We only do the merch in little batches because Risa makes it for me. We just finished a batch, so now they're not available for a long time. When you have natural immunity with antibodies, what you're doing is this, similar to the vaccines. You're creating some degree of protection, but there will be viral variants that can escape that. And natural immunity, this is a very controversial subject because we just don't have wonderful data yet. So we have to be humble in the face of what we don't know. Natural immunity works for a lot of stuff, a lot of reinfections. We don't see huge numbers of reinfections, but Delta seems to escape monoclonal antibodies, which are very specific. Natural infection has a variable effect on antibody counts, and depending on how severe your original infection was, what your viral load was, all of that, what your status is, because the vaccines are much more standardized. You know you're getting this dose twice, it's been studied, it's priming, it's all of that. 2 exposures rather than 1, as you get with the natural infection. So it's just not clear. Now, will it promote mutations? It could certainly, just like the vaccine, it could certainly start to put selective pressure on the virus to escape natural immunity from earlier strains. But even in the setting of that, let's say you get reinfected, how severe is your reinfection? Because there's T-cell immunity, there's other aspects of innate immunity that people get that may protect you against the worst aspects of that disease. So even if you're reinfected, it's like, well, who cares? I got a cold or a flu, whatever, right? So that's the way I think my current thinking is on that. Heather P., are pregnant women that are vaccinated still at the same high risk as they were last year? I think pregnant women who get COVID do much less well than non-pregnant women who get COVID. I think that risk isn't changed except dependent on the rates of virus in the community. So how likely are you to get infected? That's why LA is talking about masks, because I think their number of Delta cases are rising in unvaccinated people, and they're figuring the pressure then in the community of cases is higher. In the Bay Area, our case count's really low, yet everyone's still walking around with masks, but whatever. It's a cultural thing. So the answer is what I just said, actually, to the best of my knowledge. Ed from Brazil. Hey, Doc, do you think global travel could be back anytime soon? Also, do you believe Delta could bring a third wave to Europe despite vaccines? I think global travel depends on each country's sphincter tone and how uptight they are about COVID. Like, I don't think global travel's coming back to Australia when they're locking down again because they're mostly unvaccinated. And I think relating to that is the question of a third wave or fourth wave or whatever wave we're on. Well, it certainly could if people don't get vaccinated, because the vaccine is pretty protective. Think of it this way. Let's say we in the US didn't start vaccinating like we did in December, January. At that time, Alpha, the UK variant, was on its upswing in the US. And we were already drowning in cases from non-Alpha in the winter because the virus is seasonal, right? And people opened up and stuff and all that, mostly family events and gatherings and things like that. So Alpha was just starting to come up when the vaccines started to happen, and we started to see, and the weather warmed up and other things happened, and we start to see the things come down. And I think what would have happened is we would have seen an Alpha surge, because Alpha is more easily spread than the original, the previous, which isn't the original Wuhan strain, actually. That was superseded by another strain that became more dominant early on. But Delta, I think, inevitably would have caused a big surge, because you see what it did in India. And that was it's only like 20% or something of infections in India early on. And the UK was the other one. I mean, those are very contagious. I think the Indians might have gotten off easy early on, partially because the original strain, maybe they had some natural immunity to, and these newer variants less so. It's hard to know, right? We still don't know what's going on with India. but it's not good. I mean, the estimate's up to 10 million deaths that are undercounted. We just don't know. It's pretty crazy. So these are great questions. Thanks for the super chat money, Lisa Hinton. I appreciate it. And Ed, and let's see if anybody else is doing that I need to respond to. Oh, Alpha Takes. Sorry I didn't catch this one earlier. Love what you do. Still haven't gotten my shot. Not an anti-vaxxer, but I'm still hesitant due to recent blood clots with mRNA. Would you say that J&J is a better option for men? So Alpha Takes, I'm not sure about the blood clot thing with mRNA. I don't think that's been really established. J&J certainly has that rare blood clot risk, mostly in women. And remember, like I have two really serious blood clotting genetic predispositions that I found out when I did genetic testing with 23andMe, prothrombin 20210A and factor V Leiden, both heterozygous, that put me at a very high risk lifetime of having blood clot. And I got mRNA vaccine without hesitation because I know that COVID causes blood clots. So the minute I could get vaccinated, I did, after looking at all the data and everything, because I was quite convinced that getting COVID would be a very bad outcome for me. Now, for you, I would say this: you have to do what's right for you. So I don't know how old you are, what your predispositions are, what kind of community you're in, what the replication rate is in the community, what's going on. But I would say this: you have the data. It's out there. Just make sure you look at correct data, and then you can make a smart decision for you. And then think about other people around you that you're worried about infecting. With vaccines, we still don't have, we have decent evidence that it drops transmission, but it's not like incontrovertible evidence. So it's still possible you could be an asymptomatic carrier as a vaccinated person and pass it on, but it's less likely because I think in general your viral load is going to be quite lower. Now, we don't know what that means with Delta, because Delta is so kind of contagious-y from what we can tell, right? And even that data is a little, it's hard to do those studies. LASA International, one last question. Is it true that people with O blood type are less likely to contract COVID? I saw that data early on. It seems that there's correlation with A type and worse COVID contraction and outcomes. And there were some theories as to why that was. So I think the short answer is it's not clear. I don't know that it matters that much. I don't think it's enough to say, oh, this is how I would risk stratify people based on their blood type. I don't think that's a very useful distinction in this. By the way, you guys remember, like, early on, like, there were these big, like, again, these kind of fringy scientists would come out and put out a thing saying, I think this, right? And some of them are right and some of them are wrong. So one of them was saying, oh, this is a blood disease and this is why, and I think it has to do with hemoglobin, and everyone was talking about that. Turned out to be wrong. But then, there were people saying, hey, we shouldn't be ventilating these patients. We're causing harm. And that was a heterodox view, and that turned out to be right. So it's real interesting. I think truth gets found, right? These things get investigated. I don't think I'm not convinced that this whole thing that we're brushing a bunch of stuff under the rug, although I think there's resistance to some heterodox ideas, even when they're right. That's for sure, because of institutional capture by pharma, regulatory capture by pharma, those kind of things. They are a real phenomenon, and just conditioning, so we should be open to that. Let's see. Oh, so Greg Selwa got Pfizer first shot, then Moderna second shot in Canada. I mean, I think it makes sense. I don't think there's any reason that shouldn't work. And Canadians are mixing and matching because, take off, eh? Donald Ponder, what about Dr. Zach Bush and others that advise each person to educate themselves, but question the entire healthcare model of war against viruses and fungi, that the virome is our origin ourselves? So I haven't seen that, Donald. There are some people that think that, like, there's a lot of interesting theories, and you need them all. It's almost like a marketplace of ideas. They then can be tested and explored, and then the ones that succeed rise to the top. Sometimes just the more viral ones rise to the top, right? It's like an over-dispersed super spreader event. Rafiq Jennings, apologies for the crazy emails. I was in a bad place mentally, emotionally, and physically. Over 2020, but in a better place. I got vaccinated, J&J. Well, Rafiq, whatever you're apologizing for, it's no problem. So don't sweat it. And thanks for the support. Is Delta more spreadable by fomites? Everyone's saying Delta is more contagious, but how? Airborne, focus. Okay, so Tag G, that's a good question. Nobody knows, but the speculation is that there's more affinity for ACE2 receptor. So once it gets in you, it sticks better to the cells that it's targeting through ACE2. The other possibility is that it actually releases from ACE2 more easily and allows the rest of the infection process. The third possibility is that it lives more aggressively in the nasopharynx, and therefore people carry it more easily and spread it more easily by having higher viral load where it could easily spread. So there's a modification that allows that. And there's some other theories as well. Well, how would this affect fomites, which is a fancy way of saying surface transmission, like your phone or a counter or your shopping cart, where people in the early days were freaking out, myself included. I actually thought for sure, I was listening to Paul Offit talking about this, and he was really convinced that it was like more like a norovirus, like airborne plus surfaces, very important. I believe it was norovirus he was talking about. So yeah, I may be wrong on that. Don't quote me. And so the question is then, with this scenario, is Delta more fomitically transmitted? Because one of the possibilities, well, maybe it just lives longer on surfaces, right? But I don't think that's what they've seen so far. Like in Australia, they were looking at some transmission patterns, and it seemed to be airborne in passing transient close contact just for even seconds. So I'm not convinced there's a big fomite thing, but that could change, right? Look, washing your hands is never a bad idea for anything. It's a great idea. Just use lotion, because my hands get dry as fudge. No slouch. Sorry about the nudes. Is that what he was talking about? How is transmissibility determined? What makes one variant more transmissible than another? Now, these are kind of complex studies. And if I said I understood every aspect of them, I would be blowing smoke up your ass. And the question is, what makes one variant more transmissible than another? It's all the things I just mentioned. So all those different aspects, like, is it stickier to cells? Does it live more in the nasopharynx? Is there more of it? Does it live longer in the air and surfaces? Do you need a lower amount of the virus, a lower inoculum to be infected, which means it could circumvent cloth masks quite easily if it's inoculum dependent like that. So there's different ways that can be seen. Washing hands ain't a bad idea unless you have hand washing OCD like me, ball boys. Dude, I hear you. I used to have that. I got over it, but it's not a bad thing for a doctor to have. Yeah, so I don't know. How long have we been going here? We still got 500 people watching. Thanks for everyone who sent the super chats. Should we end it with something a little different, or let's see some more comments here. Do you think in the future there'll be pills or something to help fight COVID at home without people going to the hospital? Alexis Horan. It just depends. Like with HIV, we've come so far over years, decades of research. I'm sure something like that will happen with COVID, but only if COVID remains a kind of mortal threat that it is. If it kind of recedes into becoming a common cold, I think people will be less interested, although managing the common cold would save billions a year and a lot of secondary infections. People don't realize, like, the common cold can be an impetus to get bacterial pneumonia in elders, which often is fatal. They used to call pneumonia, when we were training, the old man's friend, because it would be the thing that offed you in a reasonably painless way. So there's that. I don't know about Sputnik. I don't know much about Sputnik, Michael Rahal. I just haven't looked into that data. I apologize. I'm a little US-centric. Hate me or don't. Mary had to Google fomites. Yeah, just surface transmission of disease is a fomite is the thing that the disease is on. It's the transmission vector. Blake Thompson, Zubin is a variant. You're right. I'm highly mutated. I have several. They call me Zubin Plus now because I've got an extra. Last last thing. Here we go. This is perfect. That's just what I was going to do. Scotty McCraggles. Can we end with a small meditation being present thing like you've done on your backyard chats, please? Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to do. So, and you guys can tune out if you don't care about this, but this is really, you know, we've been through a collective trauma the last year and a half, like everybody, and we're all kind of looking at what is it that really matters to us. And we inflict so much of the suffering that we feel is inflicted by these external things on us. Oh, they're making us wear masks, or now there's a COVID, now I have to wash my hands and I can't go to school and this and that and the other thing. And woe is me, 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 me. Where does that suffering ultimately come from? It comes from us. It comes from our mind-generated chatter, our thought processes and beliefs, which are clusters of thoughts. And so we'll do this together, but the thing I want to impress on you is that reality, what's actually real, is only this, is only what's happening right now. And we're sharing it right now live. That's the beauty of live right now, is you and I are sharing this present moment, which is all that ever is. It's all that ever could be. It's all there ever has been. It's all there ever will be. But what happens is our human minds are beautiful things. They work something like this. Right now, when I look at this camera and I feel connected to you, I feel like we're one thing. It's a weird thing that happens when I get in front of live video. The way I experience this space is a beautiful open panorama of colors and lights and shadows, sounds and feelings, little energy patterns and vibrations here and here, the sound of my voice, the lights and the colors, so sight, sound, sensation. I might smell something, I might taste something. So our five senses, all happening now, immediately, in the now. But then there's something remarkable. And I don't know if all animals do this, but humans definitely do this. In this unified field of knowing, this now, where the sense fields are just inundated with experience. It's almost like a pool of experience, just almost made of a liquid, this experience. And every now and again, it's like something pokes the pool and creates a ripple with reflections in it. That's a thought. A thought is a reflection of one of the five senses. And it happens now. The reflection is perceived in that same nowness that everything else is. But it's not the same as a sense. It's a reflection of sight, sound, sensation, emotion, which is also a kind of sensation, smell or taste. Or it's a reflection of another thought. So you go, boom, and a thought comes up, man, I have to go to work tomorrow. Okay, that's a reflection of an auditory piece of language. I hear the voice in my head. It sounds like my voice. And then what happens? That triggers more reflections. Oh, Bob is at work. I hate Bob. Bob is always mean to me. Thought, going to thought, going to thought, going to thought. Notice the last thought. Bob is always mean to me. So now what has happened? I have traveled from the present moment where everything is just happening. The sense gates are open. We're experiencing the now. I've ridden that thought. I've taken all that pool of awareness and I've focused it right into this reflection, this one ripple in the pond. And I'm surfing that ripple. I become that ripple and I'm lost. I'm lost in the future. I'm lost in a sense of I. Bob is mean to me, I, which is a thought, because in the present moment, try to find I. There's only sensation, senses, all just happening now by themselves. Anytime you find yourself riding the thought train, surfing the thought waves, lost in the sauce, all you have to do is realize that's happening and bring yourself right back here. And it'll put a big ass smile on your face. Because right here, right now, there's no problem. And there isn't even an I to have a problem. There's just beautiful sense experience happening, unfiltered, and now, and you're that. And we're all that together. And if you just do that a couple times a day, it's like Control-Alt-Deleting that pool of consciousness. Just, and it's calm again. And you start fresh with beginner's mind from absolutely nowhere. No past, no future, just this. And then if thought comes, it comes. You see it. Maybe you ride the thought train a bit. Maybe you go back into your day. But boy, even that little bit of relief is transformative. So that's how I want to end this one. In the present moment with you together. All right. Guys, I love you. That's it. I love you. We're really all the same thing. So as much as we love to fight online and be mean to each other, let's just really feel into that. Is that really what we want to do? Is it really going to bring anyone happiness beyond a little shot of dopamine for being tribally right? Probably not. All right, guys. Until next time, I got to figure out how to end this. I think I clicked this button. We're out. Bye, you guys. I love you.